The process server rang the doorbell at 8:14 in the morning, on the one day of the year I had blocked off completely, permanently, no exceptions, for the last 6 years running. My daughter's birthday. There were balloons in the trunk of my car already. 40 of them, in the colors she'd picked out herself 3 weeks earlier while sitting cross-legged on the kitchen island, teal and gold, because teal and gold, she'd informed me with the total confidence of a 6-year-old CEO, were the colors of dragons who are also princesses. There was a cake in the refrigerator that I had driven 40 minutes out of my way to pick up from the one bakery that got the frosting the way she liked it, not too sweet, with actual vanilla bean in it, little black flecks she liked to point out to anyone who'd look. There was a stack of wrapped presents on the dining room table that I'd wrapped myself the night before, badly, with too much tape, because I have never in my life been able to wrap a box so the corners look clean. And there was a man in a gray polo shirt standing on my porch at 8:14 a.m. holding a manila envelope, asking if I was Marcus Ellery. I said yes. He handed it to me, said, "You've been served," the way people say things they've said 100 times before, without weight, without meaning, and then he walked back down the steps to his car and drove away like he'd just delivered a pizza. I stood in the doorway in my socks, holding a petition for dissolution of marriage, on the morning of my daughter Hyraa'S 7th birthday. My wife was upstairs. I could hear the shower running. I could hear her humming, actually humming, some song I didn't recognize, light and unbothered, the sound of a woman getting ready for a birthday party like it was any other Saturday. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that the coffee maker finished its cycle and beeped twice and went silent. Long enough that the neighbor's dog barked at something down the street and then stopped. Long enough that I read the first page of the petition 3 times without actually absorbing a single word of it, because my eyes kept sliding off the page and landing instead on the balloons in the corner of my vision, still sitting in their plastic bag by the door, waiting to be blown up for a party that, as of 8:14 a.m., I now understood had already been planned around my absence. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't bang on the bathroom door. I didn't call her name. I set the envelope down on the hallway table, next to the bowl where we kept spare keys and old receipts and the little dragon-shaped hair clip Hyraa'S had lost 3 separate times and I had found 3 separate times, and I picked up my car keys, and I picked up the balloons, and I picked up the cake from the refrigerator, and I picked up the badly wrapped presents from the dining room table, and I walked out to my car and I loaded everything into the back seat with the kind of careful, mechanical precision you use when you are one wrong move away from either screaming or breaking down completely and you have decided, somewhere in the base of your skull, that you are going to do neither. I said nothing. And I left. I want to tell you what that drive felt like, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. The radio was still tuned to the station Hyraa'S likes, the one that plays kid-friendly pop songs on a loop, and I didn't change it, because changing it felt like it would mean something, would be an admission that the day had already stopped being about her, and I wasn't ready to make that admission yet, not even alone in a car with no one to perform for. I drove past the elementary school where she'd start 2nd grade in the fall. I drove past the little strip mall with the frozen yogurt place we'd go to sometimes after her gymnastics class, the one where she always orders too many toppings and eats about 1/3 of them. Ordinary places. Places that had, 40 minutes earlier, belonged to a completely different version of my life than the one I was apparently driving through now. I remember gripping the wheel at 10 and 2, the way you're taught to as a teenager and never actually do again once you've been driving for 20 years, because some part of my body understood, before my mind fully caught up, that I needed something rigid and correct to hold on to. I remember the specific smell of the cake box warming slightly in the back seat, vanilla and sugar, completely incongruous with what had just happened on my porch. I remember thinking, with a kind of detached, almost clinical clarity, that I had exactly one job left that day that actually mattered, and it wasn't processing what had just happened to my marriage. It was making sure a 7-year-old girl had a birthday she'd remember as one of the good ones. My name is Marcus Ellery. I'm 41 years old. I own and operate 3 urgent care clinics across the Denver metro area, a business I built from a single lease storefront in Aurora 11 years ago into something that now employs 62 people and turns a profit most private equity firms would find interesting. I am not, by nature, a man who reacts. I am a man who assesses, who waits, who lets a situation reveal its full shape before I decide what to do about it. That instinct has made me a great deal of money over the years. That morning, standing in my driveway with a car full of balloons and a divorce petition sitting on the hallway table behind me, it was the only thing standing between me and falling apart on the pavement. Before I tell you what I did with the rest of that day, and what I did over the 6 weeks that followed, let me tell you how a marriage gets to the point where a woman can file divorce papers on her own daughter's birthday and still hum in the shower 40 minutes later. Because in hindsight, the way most things are in hindsight, all the pieces were there for a long time. I just hadn't let myself look at them directly. I met Renata 9 years ago at a continuing education conference in Scottsdale, of all places, a 3-day thing on healthcare administration that I'd only attended because one of my business partners at the time had backed out at the last minute and somebody needed to sit through the compliance seminars and take notes. Renata was a pharmaceutical sales rep back then, sharp and funny and completely unimpressed by the room full of men in blazers trying to talk over each other at the hotel bar. She made fun of my tie the first night we spoke. I still have that tie. I don't know why I kept it. We dated for a year and a half before I asked her to marry me, on a bridge in Denver's Confluence Park in the middle of a light snow, which she still brought up, I should say, as one of the only times I'd ever fully surprised her. I was 31. I had 2 clinics at the time, not 3, and a business loan I was still nervous about, and none of that mattered because she said yes before I'd even finished the sentence. We got married 8 months after the proposal, a small ceremony at a lodge outside Estes Park with about 60 guests, because neither of us had ever wanted the enormous production some couples build their weddings into. Renata wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and I remember standing at the front of that room watching her walk toward me and thinking, with the kind of clarity you only get a handful of times in a life, that I had found the exact right person to build the rest of my years around. My father gave a toast that night that ran about 90 seconds too long and made half the room cry anyway, something about how the strongest structures are the ones built slow, on ground you've actually tested, and I remember catching Renata's eye across the table while he said it and both of us laughing, because we knew he was talking about concrete as much as he was talking about us. That was who he was. Everything came back to foundations with that man. The first 3 years of the marriage were, by any honest measure, good ones. Not easy, I was still building the second clinic during that stretch, which meant long stretches of 12 and 14-hour days, weekends spent doing payroll at the kitchen table while Renata worked through pharmaceutical territory reports across from me, both of us building something in parallel, tired in the specific way that people are tired when the thing they're tired from is also the thing they're proud of. We had an apartment in Wash Park before we bought the house, small enough that we could hear the neighbor's television through the wall, and I have never in my life felt as certain about anything as I felt about her during those years, cramped kitchen and thin walls and all. Hyra was born 4 years later, after a pregnancy that scared both of us more than either of us admitted to the other at the time, an early complication, 6 weeks of restricted activity, a doctor who used the word cautious more times than either of us wanted to hear it. I remember sitting in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning during one of the scarier stretches of that pregnancy, watching Renata sleep through an 4 drip, and making a private, wordless promise to both of them that I would spend the rest of my life making sure neither of them ever had to be scared like that again if I had anything to do with it. When Hyra finally arrived, 7 pounds 2 ounces, screaming loud enough that the nurses laughed, I remember thinking that whatever else happened in my life, whatever business deals went well or badly, whatever came and went, I had done the one thing that actually mattered. I had a daughter. I had a family. I had built something that would outlast every clinic, every contract, every dollar. We named her Hyra after Renata's grandmother, a woman I never got to meet but heard enough about over the years to understand exactly why the name mattered, a woman who'd raised 4 kids alone in a small town outside Guadalajara after her husband left, who never once, according to every story Renata ever told me about her, let those kids see her afraid. I think about that woman sometimes now, in a way I never expected to. I think about the fact that her name ended up attached to a little girl whose own parents' marriage would eventually come apart in a way that required exactly the kind of quiet, unshaken composure her namesake had apparently been famous for. For the first 3 years of Hyraa'S life, I would have told you my marriage was strong. Not perfect, no marriage is, but strong. Renata had left her sales job to be home with Hyra full-time, which had been her choice, one she'd made clearly and firmly, and I'd supported it the way I support things, financially, structurally, without much conversation, because that's how I'd learned to show up for people. I built. I provided. I assumed the providing was the love, or at least a fluent enough dialect of it that the message was getting through. I started noticing the shift about 18 months ago. Small things. The kind of things you notice and then talk yourself out of noticing, because naming them makes them real, and you'd rather live in the version of your life where you didn't see what you saw. Renata had rejoined the workforce about 2 years ago, doing marketing consulting for a boutique firm downtown, flexible hours, mostly remote, work she genuinely seemed to enjoy, work I encouraged, because I have never in my life wanted a partner who felt smaller than herself for my sake. But somewhere in that transition, the texture of things started to change. She started taking client calls in the car, in the garage, with the door down, when there was an entire empty house to take a phone call in. She started referring to a colleague named Derek with a familiarity that outpaced how often she claimed to actually see him. Derek says, Derek thinks, Derek and I were talking about, until Derek became a kind of ambient presence in our conversations, a third person in the room who was never actually in the room. She stopped asking about the clinics. That one hit different than the others, because for years, Renata had been the person I processed my hardest days with, a difficult vendor negotiation, a staffing crisis at the Aurora location, the slow grinding stress of watching insurance reimbursement rates erode margins that used to be comfortable. She used to ask good questions. Sharp ones. The kind that told me she was actually listening, actually thinking about it alongside me. And then one day, without any announcement, she just stopped. I'd come home and she'd ask about Hyraa'S day, ask what we should do for dinner, and my day, the thing that used to be a shared project between us, simply wasn't part of the conversation anymore. Like she'd quietly resigned from a position I hadn't known was up for resignation. She started going to the gym at hours that didn't line up with any class schedule I could find when I looked, which I want to be honest and tell you I did look, once, late one night, scrolling through the gym's website trying to match her spin class to an actual spin class, and finding nothing at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. I closed the laptop. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself a lot of things. There was a night, about 5 months before all of this came to a head, when I woke up around 1 a.m. and found the bed empty beside me. I found her downstairs in the kitchen, phone face down on the counter the second she heard my footsteps on the stairs, a cup of tea going cold in front of her that she clearly hadn't been drinking so much as holding. Couldn't sleep, she said, before I'd asked anything. I believed her, mostly, because believing her was easier than the alternative, and because I had no evidence yet, only a feeling, and I have never been a man who acts on feelings alone in business or otherwise. I went back to bed. I lay awake for a long time listening for her footsteps on the stairs behind me. They didn't come for almost 40 minutes. There was another moment, smaller, almost embarrassing in how little it was, that I've thought about more than almost anything else since. Hyra had a school function, a spring assembly where the kindergarten class sang 2 songs they'd been rehearsing for weeks, and Renata had said she'd try to make it, work permitting. She didn't make it. That wasn't unusual on its own, both of us miss things sometimes, that's the reality of 2 working parents. What stuck with me was that when I got home that evening and mentioned, gently, that Hyra had looked around the auditorium during the second song, scanning the crowd for her, Renata's response wasn't guilt. It was mild irritation, directed at me, for bringing it up at all. I said I'd try, Marcus. I had a client call. I let it go. I filed it away instead, the way I'd learned to file away all of it, in the growing folder in the back of my mind labeled, though I never would have said this out loud even to myself at the time, evidence. If any of this is landing for you, if you felt that particular kind of static in a relationship, the sense that someone you love has quietly moved their center of gravity somewhere else without telling you, go ahead and drop a like on this video right now. It helps more than you'd think, and it lets me know I'm not just telling this story into the void. I didn't confront her. Not because I was scared of the answer, though maybe some part of me was. I didn't confront her because I have run a business long enough to know that confronting a problem before you understand its full shape just teaches the other side to hide better. I have sat across the table from vendors who were quietly overbilling us for 2 years, and I have learned that the moment you show your hand too early, you lose the only leverage you have, which is that they don't know you know. So I watched. I paid attention in the specific, patient way I pay attention to a spreadsheet that doesn't quite add up. And I let Hyraa'S birthday get planned, because that was one thing I refused to let get contaminated by whatever was happening between her mother and me. I wanted that day to be exactly what it had always been. Pure. Uncomplicated. A little girl in a teal and gold dress blowing out 7 candles surrounded by people who loved her. I did not expect to be served divorce papers on the porch at 8:14 in the morning, on that day, by a man in a gray polo shirt who called it a Tuesday. I drove. I didn't decide to drive anywhere in particular. I just started the car, and I pulled out of the driveway, and I drove north out of the neighborhood with a trunk full of balloons and a back seat full of birthday presents and a cake slowly starting to sweat condensation onto its box in the Colorado morning heat, and somewhere around the 3rd stoplight, my hands started shaking on the wheel. Not from fear. From the sheer effort of holding something enormous perfectly still inside my chest. I pulled into the parking lot of a coffee shop I don't even like, just to have somewhere to sit that wasn't my car and wasn't my house, and I called my sister. Danielle is 38, 2 years younger than me, and she runs a mid-size accounting firm out of a converted warehouse space in Reno. She is the only person in my family who has ever been able to tell, just from the sound of my voice on the first 3 words of a phone call, exactly how bad something is. "Marcus," she said, before I'd even said anything. "What happened?" I told her. All of it, the doorbell, the envelope, the shower running, the humming. I told it flat, the way I'd tell her about a lease renegotiation, because if I let any inflection into my voice at all, I wasn't sure what would come out with it. She was quiet for a second. Then she said the thing that I think, looking back, set the entire tone for everything that came after. "Okay," she said. "First, is Hyraa'S safe? Is she with someone? Does she know anything's wrong?" "She's with Renata. She doesn't know yet. It's her birthday, Danny." "I know what day it is." A pause. "Okay. Second question, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer. What do you want to happen next? Not what you're feeling. What you want to happen." Nobody had asked me that yet. Not even myself. I looked out the windshield at a stranger walking a dog across the parking lot, completely unaware that anything in the world had shifted, and I said, "I want Hyraa'S birthday to still be a good day for her. And I want everything else to be handled quietly, completely, and on my terms. I don't want a fight in the driveway. I don't want a scene at the party. I want this to be the kind of thing where by the time anyone realizes how serious I am, it's already done." "That's not feeling," Danielle said. "That's a plan." "Good. Come to my office. Bring the balloons." I want to pause here and tell you something about myself that matters for the rest of this story, because I think it's the thing that separates how I handled that day from how a lot of people would have. I have never, in my adult life, believed that the biggest reaction is the strongest one. I've watched business partners blow up relationships and negotiations because they needed the other person to feel their anger in the moment, needed the scene, needed the raised voice, and I've watched every single one of those blow-ups cost them leverage they never got back. The angriest person in the room is very rarely the one who wins the room. The calmest person is the one who's already thinking 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still reacting to move 1. My father taught me that, in a roundabout way, without ever using those words. He ran a small construction supply company for 30 years, dealt with vendors who tried to shortchange him constantly, and I never once saw him raise his voice at a supplier who screwed him. What I saw him do was quietly stop doing business with them, redirect that revenue somewhere else, and let them figure out 6 months later why their numbers had started slipping. Anger is expensive and it doesn't collect, he used to say. Consequences are free and they always collect eventually. Standing in that coffee shop parking lot with a cake sweating in my back seat, I decided that whatever else happened, I was not going to spend a single dollar of anger that day. Not on the phone with Renata. Not at the birthday party. Not in front of my daughter, ever, for any reason, as long as I lived. I was going to spend all of it on consequences instead. If you've ever had to make that same choice, to hold something enormous perfectly still because someone smaller than the problem was watching you, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. This channel exists because people share those stories, and I read every single one. I got to Danielle's office a little after 9. She met me in the parking lot, took one look at the back seat of my car, and didn't say a word about the balloons. She just helped me carry everything inside, set the cake in her office fridge, and sat me down across from her desk with a legal pad and 2 cups of coffee neither of us touched. "Talk me through the marriage," she said. "Not the good years. The last 18 months. Everything you noticed and didn't say anything about." So I did. The phone calls in the garage. Derek. The gym schedule that didn't match any class. The way she'd stopped asking about the clinics. The way, over the last few months especially, she'd started looking at me during conversations with something that wasn't quite absence but wasn't quite presence either, like she was already halfway through drafting a version of her life that didn't include the conversation we were currently having. Danielle wrote almost none of it down. She just listened, the way she listens to a client walk her through a year of bad bookkeeping, patient and expressionless, until you get to the number that actually matters. She let me talk without interrupting, which is not something my sister does easily. Danielle runs a firm where she's used to being the one steering every conversation toward a bottom line, and when I finally trailed off, having circled back for a second time to the sound of the shower running upstairs while I stood there holding the envelope, she reached across the desk and put her hand flat on top of mine for a second, just a second, before pulling it back and picking her pen back up. Because that's as much softness as either of us has ever really needed from the other. We're not a hugging family. We're a showing up family, and she'd shown up, and that was the whole language of it. "Okay," she said when I finished. "Here's what I think is true. I think this has been coming for a while and you've known it somewhere underneath the part of you that didn't want to know it. And I think today, whatever the reason, she decided the wait was over, and she picked the birthday because either she didn't think it through, or, Danielle stopped. Or what? Or she wanted you distracted and off balance for the party so you wouldn't make a scene in front of her family, who I'm guessing are coming today. Her parents were coming. Renata's mother, Yolanda, and her father, Preston, both flying in from Sacramento, landing at 11, expecting to be picked up from the airport at noon, expecting a party at 4. I sat with that for a second. Then I asked Danielle the only question that actually mattered to me in that moment. Can I still give Hyra a good birthday today? Today specifically. Can I actually do that? Yes, Danielle said, without hesitation. You absolutely can. And you're going to. Everything else, we handle after she goes to bed. Here is what I did with the rest of that day, and I want to walk you through it in order, because the order matters. I did not call Renata. I let her call me, which she did, for times between 9:40 and 10:15, each call going straight past my thumb hovering over the decline button. I wasn't avoiding her out of cowardice. I was avoiding her because I knew, with complete certainty, that the version of me who picked up that call at 9:41 in the morning, for minutes after processing what had happened, was not the version of me I wanted representing my daughter's interests for the rest of this. I needed an hour. I gave myself an hour. At 10:20, I called my attorney. Priya Anand has handled every piece of legal work my business has needed for the last 7 years, contracts, a lease dispute, a wrongful termination claim from a nurse practitioner I'd had to let go for cause. She doesn't do family law exclusively, but she knew every family attorney in the city worth knowing, and within 15 minutes of my call, she had connected me with a colleague named Robert Fazzo, a divorce and custody specialist with a reputation, Priya told me, for being quiet, thorough, and absolutely merciless when someone gives him a reason to be. I liked the sound of that a great deal. Robert and I spoke for 20 minutes. I told him everything, the timeline, the papers, the behavior I'd noticed over the last 18 months, the fact that Renata had chosen, whether by design or by carelessness, to have me served on our daughter's birthday. He was quiet through most of it, the way a good attorney listens, and at the end he said something that I've thought about many times since. The timing of service isn't going to move the needle on the divorce itself. Colorado's no fault, so what she did today doesn't legally punish her. But it tells you everything about her judgment right now, and judgment is exactly what a custody evaluator is going to be looking at. I'd suggest you document today, thoroughly, calmly, and I'd suggest you let the day speak for itself instead of you speaking for it. Document it. Let it speak for itself. I understood exactly what he meant. I picked up the balloons and the cake and the presents from Danielle's office fridge, and I drove home. Renata was in the kitchen when I walked in, phone in her hand, and I watched her face do something complicated when she saw me, relief, maybe, or the beginning of an argument she'd already rehearsed, and then confusion, because I wasn't giving her anything to argue against. I set the cake on the counter. I set the presents on the dining table exactly where they'd been that morning. I started blowing up balloons. "Marcus," she said. "We need to talk about." "We do," I agreed, tying off a teal balloon and setting it on the growing pile. "Not today. Today is Hyraa'S birthday, and I intend for it to be a good one. If you'd like to help me set up the backyard, I could use it. If you'd rather not be here, that's your decision to make, but I'm not having this conversation in the 4 hours before our daughter blows out her candles." She stared at me. I think, in retrospect, she had expected a fight. I think some part of her, maybe even an unconscious part, had chosen the timing precisely because she expected a fight, expected me to be too destabilized to function normally, expected the day itself to become evidence of how badly I'd handled the news. She had not expected me to simply keep going. She helped me set up the backyard. We didn't speak beyond logistics, where the folding tables should go, whether we had enough ice, what time her parents' flight was landing. It was, in its own strange way, one of the more civil afternoons we'd had together in months, which told me something uncomfortable about how far apart we'd already drifted before that morning ever happened. Hyra came downstairs around noon in the teal and gold dress she'd picked out herself, spun once in the kitchen to make it flare, and asked if the Dragon Princess balloons had arrived. I told her they absolutely had, and her whole face did the thing that 7-year-old faces do when the entire world is, for one uncomplicated moment, exactly the way they'd hoped it would be. I have never been more grateful for anything in my life than I was for the ability to give her that moment without a single crack showing through. If you're a parent and you've ever had to build a good day for your kid out of the wreckage of a very bad one for yourself, I want you to know, that's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. Hit subscribe if you needed to hear that today. The party ran from 4 to 7. Renata's parents arrived a little before it started, and if either of them knew what had happened that morning, they gave no indication of it, which told me, later, that Renata hadn't told them either, which told me even later than that some part of her had understood, on some level, that what she'd done was going to look exactly as bad to other people as it had felt to me. Yolanda hugged me at the door the way she always had, warm and a little too tight, and told me the backyard looked wonderful, and asked whether I'd finally hired someone for the landscaping or if I'd done the flower beds myself again, because you always did have more patience for that than Preston ever did. I told her I'd done them myself, the previous weekend, which was true, and which I did not mention I'd done partly as a distraction from something I hadn't even known yet was coming. Preston shook my hand with the firm, appraising grip of a man who'd spent 30 years running dealerships and sizing people up before he'd finished saying hello, and asked how the third clinic was performing, a question he asked every single time we saw each other, because Preston is a man who understands business the way some people understand weather, instinctively, constantly, as background noise to every other conversation. I told him revenue was up 11% quarter-over-quarter. He nodded, satisfied, the way he always did, and moved on to the cooler. I made small talk with Preston about a home renovation he was doing on the guest bathroom. I helped Yolanda carry a cooler out to the patio and listened to her tell me, for what might have been the fourth time in as many years, about a cruise she and Preston were considering for their 40th anniversary. I refilled the lemonade pitcher twice. I chased down a stray teal balloon that had escaped the ribbon it was tied to and gone drifting lazily up over the fence line into the neighbor's yard, and I climbed over to retrieve it because Hyra had noticed it was missing and her face had started to fall, and there was no version of that day where I was going to let her feel even one small loss on top of everything she didn't yet know had happened. I lit 7 candles on a cake with actual vanilla bean in the frosting, and I watched my daughter close her eyes, make a wish she wouldn't tell anyone, and blow them all out in one breath while a backyard full of people who loved her sang badly and off-key. Renata stood beside me during the song, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, both of us performing a unity that, 11 hours earlier, she had unilaterally decided to end. I sang anyway. I sang loud and a little off-key myself, the way I do every year, because Hyra likes it when I sing badly on purpose, says it's funnier that way, and I was not going to be the reason the singing sounded any different than it always had. I did not look at Renata during any of it. Not out of hostility. I simply didn't have anything to say to her yet that belonged anywhere near that moment. At 7:15, after the last guest had left and Hyra had fallen asleep on the couch in her party dress with frosting still on one cheek, I carried her up to bed myself, the way I always have on her birthdays, and I sat on the edge of her bed for a minute in the dark, the way I always do, just watching her breathe, before I went back downstairs to have the conversation I'd been holding at arm's length for 11 hours. Renata was sitting at the kitchen table when I came down, the manila envelope from that morning sitting in front of her, unopened still on my end, opened on hers. She'd clearly read her own copy at some point during the day. "We should talk," she said. "We should," I agreed, and I sat down across from her. "You've been so calm all day," she said. "I don't understand it. I don't know what I thought you'd do." "What did you want me to do, Renata?" She didn't answer that directly. Instead she said, "I've been unhappy for a long time. Longer than I think either of us has wanted to admit. And I know today wasn't, I know the timing was bad." "The timing wasn't bad," I said. "The timing was a choice. You had 6 years of Saturdays to pick from. You picked this one." I kept my voice level. I want to be clear about that, because I know how this reads on paper, like I was building towards something sharp. I wasn't raising my voice. I never raised my voice, not once, the entire conversation. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, in the particular tone people use when they've decided honesty is the only currency they have left to spend, she said, "Because I knew if I told you any other day, you'd find a way to make me stay for one more birthday. One more holiday. One more milestone. There's always going to be another one, Marcus." I needed there to be a hard line, and I knew the only way to actually hold it was to make the decision bigger than any single day could talk me out of. I sat with that. In a strange way, it was the most honest thing she'd said to me in months, and it did something I hadn't expected. It told me this wasn't recklessness. It was calculation, on her part too, just a different kind than mine. She had used our daughter's birthday as a structural device to force her own follow-through. That's not an accident. That's a decision made by someone who had already, on some level, stopped weighing my feelings, or Hyraa'S, as a variable worth protecting. "Is there someone else?" I asked. Not because I needed the confirmation for myself. I already knew. I asked because I wanted to watch how she answered it. Another pause. Longer this time. "There's someone I've been talking to," she said. "Derek. From the firm. Nothing happened, Marcus, not physically, I want to be clear about that. But I think I started imagining a different life a while ago, and once you start imagining it, it's very hard to stop." I nodded slowly. "Okay," I said. That single word, the exact word Renata had never expected, landed the way it always does. I saw something shift in her face, the same recalibration I imagine happens in every version of this conversation that's ever taken place at a kitchen table anywhere in the world. She'd braced for anger. She got a closed door instead, and closed doors are so much harder to argue with than open ones. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was waiting for the second half of a sentence that never came. "You're not going to ask me anything else," she said. "How long? Where? Whether I love him? Nothing? Would the answers change what I'm going to do next?" "No," she admitted. "I don't think they would." "Then I don't need them," I said. "Not tonight, anyway. Maybe someday I'll want to understand the whole shape of it, for my own reasons, not because it changes anything between us. But tonight, I have one job, which is figuring out how to be a good father to a little girl who's asleep upstairs with frosting still on her cheek, and everything else can wait until I've done that job properly." "That's it?" she said. "Okay. We built a life together, Marcus. We have a daughter." "We do," I said. "And I intend to be the best father I know how to be to her, starting tomorrow morning and every morning after that, regardless of anything that happens between us." "But you filed papers this morning, Renata. You made the decision. I'm not going to fight you for a marriage you've already left. I'm just going to make sure the rest of this is handled the way I handle everything, carefully, and completely, and on terms that protect our daughter first." I stood up. "I'll be staying in the guest room tonight. Robert Fazzo will be in touch with your attorney this week. Get some sleep. Hyra's going to want pancakes in the morning, and I intend to be the one making them. I want to tell you honestly, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling, that I did not sleep that night. I lay in the guest room staring at a ceiling fan turning slowly in the dark, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, the calm I'd been holding all day finally cracked, quietly, privately, the way it should. I am not a man who cries often. I cried that night, alone, in a room that wasn't mine, in a house that no longer felt like it entirely belonged to me either, grieving something that had ended long before I'd been handed the paperwork to prove it. But I did it there. Alone. In the dark. Not at the party. Not in front of Hyra. Not in front of Renata's parents. That mattered to me then and it matters to me now. By morning, I had made my pancakes, and I had made my decisions. There's one more phone call from that first week I haven't told you about yet, and I've saved it for here because it's the one that actually shaped everything that came after. My father passed 4 years ago, which I mentioned earlier, but my mother is still alive, 73 years old, sharp as anything, living about 20 minutes from us in a townhouse she downsized into after he died. I called her on the Tuesday after the party, once Hyra was at school and I had an hour to myself that I didn't know what to do with. "I already know," she said, before I'd gotten more than a sentence out. "Danielle called me Sunday night. I was waiting to see if you'd call me yourself or if I'd have to drive over there. That's my mother. Not cold, exactly, just a woman who's never once in her life waited around for someone else to manage a crisis for her. I don't know what I'm doing, Mom," I told her, which was the first completely honest thing I'd said out loud to anyone since the doorbell rang. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Your father used to say something about the supply business that I think about more than almost anything else he ever told me. He said the vendors who tried to shortchange him always wanted a reaction. They wanted him angry, because angry men make sloppy decisions and sloppy decisions are easy to take advantage of. He said the ones who actually beat him, the very few, were the ones who stayed so calm he couldn't tell what they were thinking until it was already done." She paused. "You're doing the same thing right now, aren't you? Staying calm so nobody can tell what you're thinking. I don't know if I'm doing it on purpose or if I just don't know how to do anything else." "Doesn't matter which," she said. "Just don't let calm turn into silence with Hyra. There's a difference between not making a scene and not talking to your daughter when she starts asking questions, and she will start asking questions, Marcus, sooner than you think. Kids always do. What do I tell her? The truth, in pieces small enough for her to carry. Not the whole weight of it. Just enough that she never feels like she's the one keeping a secret from herself. She let that sit for a second. Your father used to say the foundation matters more than anything built on top of it. You already know that. You've built 3 businesses on that exact idea. Build this the same way. Slow. Tested. Something that'll hold her weight for the next 18 years, not just something that looks steady this week. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time after that, and I think that conversation did more to set the tone of the next 6 weeks than anything Robert Fazio or Priya Anand ever told me, good as their advice was. My mother had given me the only instruction that actually mattered: don't confuse composure with silence. Stay calm, but stay present. Don't let the discipline that was protecting me from falling apart become the same discipline that kept me from actually showing up for the one person in this whole story who hadn't chosen any of it. I took that seriously. Over the following weeks, whenever Hyra asked, and my mother was right, she did start asking, first small questions about why mommy was staying at a different house sometimes, and then, a few weeks later, the harder one, why mommy and daddy weren't going to live together anymore. I answered her honestly, in pieces sized exactly for a 7-year-old to hold without dropping. I told her that sometimes grown-ups who love each other very much still decide they're better at being a family in 2 houses instead of 1. I told her that nothing about it was her fault, ever, in any way, and I told her that more than once, because I've read enough about how kids process divorce to know that the guilt, if it takes root, is the thing that does the real damage, far more than the 2 household logistics ever will. I told her that both her parents loved her exactly the same amount as they always had, which was true, and which I made sure, through every single decision in the 6 weeks that followed, to actually demonstrate rather than just say. Here's the thing about how I run my life that people who only know me casually don't always understand: I don't separate business Marcus from personal Marcus. It's the same brain, the same discipline, the same refusal to let a bad moment dictate a bad decision. So when it came time to actually handle the separation, legally, financially, logistically, I approached it the exact same way I'd approach an underperforming clinic location. Assess. Contain. Restructure. Protect what matters. Move forward. The first thing I protected was Hyra's routine. I told Robert, in that very first call, that I did not care about winning some symbolic victory in the divorce filing. I cared about 2 things: a custody arrangement that kept Hyra's life as stable and predictable as possible, and financial protection that made sure nothing about her upbringing, her school, her activities, her sense of security, changed because her parents' marriage hadn't survived. Robert built the custody proposal around that from day one, and to Renata's credit, she didn't fight me on the core structure of it. Whatever else had gone wrong between us, neither of us wanted Hyra to become collateral damage in a war neither of us actually wanted to wage on each other in front of her. The second thing I did was quietly, methodically separate our finances, not punitively, not in a way designed to strand Renata, but cleanly, the way you close out a joint venture that's run its course. I moved my clinic ownership structures, which had always technically included her as a minority stakeholder for tax purposes back when we were still filing jointly and optimizing for that, into a trust structure that Priya had actually recommended years earlier and I'd never gotten around to setting up. It wasn't retaliation. It was simply, finally, doing the thing that any competent business owner should have done from the beginning, separating personal relationship risk from business continuity risk. It happened to become extremely relevant timing, but the move itself had been sitting on my to-do list for 3 years. The third thing I did was the one thing in this entire story that I will admit had an edge of something sharper to it, and I want to be honest about that instead of pretending my calm was total and untouched by any human feeling at all. Derek, the colleague from Renata's marketing firm, did contract work, I discovered, for a number of small local businesses in the Denver area, including, as it turned out, 2 vendors that supplied administrative software to one of my clinics. It was a small world, the kind Denver often is once you scratch below the surface, and it took exactly 1 phone call to my operations director to confirm that Derek's firm had a standing services contract with a company we did business with, a contract that was up for renewal in about 7 weeks. I did not sabotage anything. I want to be extremely clear about that, because there's a version of this story where I tell you I burned the man's business to the ground out of spite, and that's not what happened, and it's not who I am. What I did was simple. I let my operations director know, factually and without editorializing, that our vendor's subcontractor had a personal entanglement with my soon-to-be ex-wife, and that I'd prefer, given the obvious conflict, that we evaluate other subcontracting options at renewal. That's not revenge. That's a reasonable business boundary that any company would set given the circumstances. Whether Derek's firm lost that renewal because of anything I did, or because a competing bid simply came in better, is honestly not something I tracked closely enough to tell you with certainty. I didn't need to. I'd made my point to myself, if to no one else, I was not a man who could be quietly humiliated without the world around him rearranging itself, even slightly, in response. If that sounds like a small thing to you, you're right. It was small. But it was mine, and after a day like the one I'd had, I was entitled to one small thing that was mine. I want to talk for a minute about Robert Fazio, because the working relationship we built over those 6 weeks taught me more about how to handle conflict than almost anything else in this story. Robert had a rule he repeated to me at least 3 separate times during our first 2 meetings, and I've carried it with me since. Every document you file, every email you send, every voicemail you leave, is something a judge might read someday, even if this never gets anywhere near a courtroom. Write everything as if a stranger with no context is going to read it and form an opinion of your character from it alone. That single piece of advice changed how I handled every single interaction with Renata for the rest of the process. I stopped writing quick, clipped texts when I was frustrated. I stopped letting sarcasm creep into logistics emails about pickup times. Every message I sent, I wrote as though it might be printed out and placed in front of a custody evaluator, because it might be, and because more than anything else, I wanted the paper trail of that entire 6 weeks to reflect who I actually was, not who a bad morning had briefly threatened to turn me into. There was one meeting, about 3 weeks in, that I still think about. Robert had scheduled what he called a 4-way, himself, Priya sitting in as my business counsel since the trust restructuring overlapped with the settlement, Renata, and her attorney, a competent, no-nonsense woman named Carol Ibsen, all in the same conference room at once to hammer out the custody schedule directly instead of going back and forth through letters for another month. I remember sitting across that table from Renata, both of us with legal pads and our respective attorneys flanking us, and thinking how strange it was that 2 people who'd built an entire life and a daughter together were now negotiating the architecture of that daughter's childhood across a laminate conference table with fluorescent lighting overhead. Carol opened with a proposal that gave Renata slightly more time during the school year, citing her more flexible remote work schedule. Robert countered, calmly, with data, my clinic hours, my ability to structure my week around pickups and drop-offs given that I own the business rather than answer to one, the fact that I'd already restructured my Tuesday and Thursday schedules specifically to accommodate exactly this kind of arrangement before we'd even sat down in that room. Renata, to her credit, didn't fight the counter once she heard the reasoning. That's fair, she said, and Carol, after a brief pause, agreed. It was, I remember thinking at the time, the single least dramatic hour of the entire 6 weeks, and also somehow the one that mattered most, because it was the hour where the actual shape of Hyraa'S future got decided, quietly, by 4 adults choosing precision over ego. There was one moment during that process where the calm I'd been holding onto for weeks nearly cracked in public, and I think it's worth telling you about. Because I don't want this story to sound like I moved through those 6 weeks without a single wobble. About 4 weeks in, Renata's attorney sent over a proposed revision to the holiday schedule that would have had Hyraa'S spending every Thanksgiving with Renata's side of the family in Sacramento, indefinitely, on the grounds that it was important for her to maintain her connection to her extended maternal family. I read that line at my kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, alone, and something in me that had been steady for a month went white-hot in about 4 seconds. Not because Sacramento was unreasonable, Yolanda and Preston were good grandparents, and Hyra'a loved them, but because the proposal gave every single Thanksgiving to one side, permanently, without so much as a rotating year, and buried inside that language was the first real signal I'd seen that someone on the other side of this was starting to negotiate for advantage rather than for fairness. I wrote an email to Robert that night that I am not proud of. I want to be honest about that too. It wasn't cruel, exactly, but it was sharp, and it used the word unacceptable 3 times in 4 sentences, and it was not, by any measure, the kind of document I'd have wanted a stranger reading to form an opinion of my character. I sat with my thumb over the send button for a long moment, and then, because some old instinct kicked in at exactly the right time, I didn't send it. I closed the laptop. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't really want, and I sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes doing nothing at all except breathing, and then I opened the laptop back up and wrote a different email. Calm. Specific. I proposed alternating Thanksgiving starting that year with Renata's family, the next year with mine, going forward indefinitely, and I laid out, plainly and without heat, why an every year arrangement for one side wasn't something I could agree to. Robert forwarded a version of that reasoning to Carol the next morning. Renata agreed to the alternating schedule within 2 days, no further pushback, and I've always wondered, quietly, whether that particular ask had even come from her directly or whether it had simply been an overzealous first draft from her attorney that nobody had fully thought through. Either way, it resolved itself the same way almost everything else in that process did, not through anger, but through a version of me that had learned, the hard way, to sit with the anger privately until it turned into something useful instead of something regrettable. I tell you that story because I don't want you walking away from this thinking composure means nothing ever tests you. It tested me constantly. The difference between the man who nearly sent that first email and the man who actually sent the second one is the entire subject of this video, if I'm honest. It's not that I didn't feel the anger. It's that I built, slowly, over years of doing this in a business context long before I ever had to do it in a personal one, a habit of never letting the version of me that's angry be the version of me that hits send. The financial side took longer to finalize than the custody side, mostly because untangling 11 years of joint accounts, a mortgage, retirement contributions, and the trust restructuring I'd initiated took real time to do correctly. Priya walked me through every step of it with the same patience she'd shown handling my business contracts for years, and more than once during that process I found myself grateful, in a strange, sideways way, that I'd built relationships with people who did their jobs with exactly the kind of careful precision I was trying to hold on to for myself. Nothing about the financial settlement was punitive. Renata kept what was fairly hers. I kept what was fairly mine. Neither of us walked away feeling like we'd won or lost, which Robert told me, more than once, was usually the sign of a settlement that had actually been done right. The 6 weeks between the day I was served and the day the settlement was finalized were, without question, the hardest sustained stretch of my adult life, and I don't say that lightly, because I've weathered a business recession, a malpractice scare at one of my clinics that turned out to be unfounded but took 8 months to fully resolve, and the death of my father 4 years ago. This was harder than all of it, in its own quiet way, because it required me to grieve something enormous while simultaneously performing complete normalcy for the sake of a 7-year-old who deserved, more than anyone in this story, to have her life disrupted as little as humanly possible. Every morning, I made pancakes, or eggs, or the specific too-sweet cereal Hyraa'S loved that Renata had always been slightly judgmental about. Every night, whenever it was my night, I read the same 3 books in the same rotating order because that's what Hyraa'S wanted, and I never once let her see me anything other than steady. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being steady on purpose, for someone else's sake, while your own foundation is being dismantled underneath you. I don't think people talk about that enough. Everyone talks about the moment of the betrayal, the dramatic confrontation, the big speech. Nobody talks about the 6 weeks of pancakes. If you're in that stretch right now, the quiet, unglamorous middle of holding it together for someone smaller than you while everything else falls apart, I see you. That's the actual hard part. Comment below if you know exactly what I mean. I read every one of them, and I think a lot of people in this comment section could use hearing from each other right now, not just from me. Robert called me on a Thursday afternoon, 6.5 weeks after that first birthday morning, to tell me the settlement had been finalized. It was, by his account and Priya's both, about as clean and low conflict as a divorce involving significant assets ever gets. Renata kept her retirement accounts and her car. I kept the clinics, structured cleanly through the trust, and the house, which Hyra would need to stay in her school district, her same room, her same backyard where 40 balloons had once floated over a birthday party held on the worst day of my adult life. We settled into a 50-50 custody arrangement, week on, week off, with holidays split evenly and both of us committed, in writing and, more importantly, in practice, to never using Hyra as a messenger or a weapon. I want to tell you that Renata and I are enemies now, because I think that's the version of this story people expect, the version that makes for a cleaner ending. It isn't true. We are not friends, not the way we once were, but we are civil, functional, and unified on the one subject that actually matters, which is that our daughter deserves two parents who show up for her without dragging her through the wreckage of what happened between them. Business, in the meantime, had not simply survived the disruption. It had, in a strange and almost uncomfortable way, benefited from it. The trust restructuring I'd finally completed under pressure gave me a cleaner operating structure across all 3 clinics than I'd had in years, one that made it substantially easier, 6 months later, to bring on a 4th location in Lakewood, something I'd been quietly considering for over a year but had never quite found the bandwidth to formalize while I was still folding personal financial planning into a marriage that, in retrospect, hadn't wanted the same long-term structure I did. My operations director told me, half joking, over drinks after we signed the Lakewood lease, that getting divorced had apparently been good for business. I didn't laugh, not really, but I understood what he meant, and there was a strange, complicated comfort in watching something genuinely good get built directly out of the wreckage of something that had ended. I ran into Derek exactly once, about 5 months after the party, at a business mixer downtown that neither of us, I think, expected the other to be at. He recognized me before I recognized him. I'd only ever seen a photo, once, on Renata's phone, glimpsed rather than studied, and he approached me at the bar with the particular nervous energy of a man deciding, in real time, whether an apology was owed and whether he was brave enough to give it. "Marcus Ellery," he said. "I think we should probably talk, or I should, at least." I looked at him for a second. He was younger than I'd pictured, though not by much, and there was nothing about him that struck me as remarkable in any direction, not impressive, not villainous, just an ordinary man who'd made an ordinary set of choices that happened to intersect with the worst morning of my life. "You don't owe me anything," I told him, and I meant it, more than I expected to when the sentence started. "You didn't file the papers. You didn't choose the date. Whatever happened between you and Renata was between the two of you, and honestly, by the time I found out any of it, my marriage had already been over for longer than either of us probably wanted to admit." He looked, if anything, more unsettled by that than he would have been by anger. I finished my drink and told him to have a good night, and I meant that too. There wasn't room left in me for him to occupy. I'd used it all up on more important things months earlier. I ran into Renata about 4 months after the divorce was finalized, at Hyraa'S school for a parent-teacher conference, one of the few things we still occasionally overlap on by necessity. She looked well. Not happy exactly, or not in a way I could clearly read, but settled, the way people look when they've finally landed somewhere after a long stretch of being in motion. "You handled all of it better than I deserved," she said to me, out of nowhere, while we waited outside Hyraa'S classroom for our turn. I thought about that for a second. "I didn't handle it for you," I said, not unkindly. "I handled it for her." I nodded toward the closed classroom door, behind which our daughter was, at that exact moment, probably drawing something with entirely too much glitter glue. Everything I did, every decision, all of it, was about making sure she never had to know how bad that first day actually was for me. If it happened to look generous to you along the way, that was a byproduct. It wasn't the point. She nodded slowly, like she understood that, maybe for the first time. "Derek and I aren't together anymore, if that matters," she said. It didn't turn into what I thought it might. "It doesn't matter to me either way," I told her, and I meant it. By that point, it genuinely didn't. Whatever anger I'd carried in the beginning had burned itself down into something quieter, something that no longer needed anything from her to feel resolved. "I hope you build whatever it is you were looking for. I mean that." But I'm done being part of the foundation for someone else's next chapter unless I actually get a say in how the story goes. She didn't have a response for that. I don't think there was one that would have fit in a school hallway between two parent-teacher conferences. Hyraa'S 8th birthday came around 11 months after that first one, the balloon morning, the one I now think of privately as the day everything split cleanly into before and after, though I've never once used those words to her. We threw her a party in the backyard again, the same backyard, though the arrangement now was that both Renata and I attended together, civilly, for the 2 hours it took to sing, blow out candles, and watch a 7-year-old become an 8-year-old in the particular blur that birthdays always are. There were no balloons in gray polo shirts on the porch that year. No manila envelopes. Just cake, and glitter glue somehow making an appearance even outside of school, and a little girl who has absolutely no idea, and I intend for it to stay that way for as long as I possibly can, just how much her father was holding together the last time we did this. I watched her blow out 8 candles, make another silent wish, and I thought about my father's old line, the one about anger being expensive and consequences being free. I'd spent almost nothing on anger that whole year. I'd let consequences do all the collecting instead, a clean settlement built entirely around her well-being, a business that had not just survived the disruption but actually grown, having finally forced me to formalize protections I should have set up years earlier, and a version of myself that had come through the worst single morning of his adult life without ever once letting his daughter see the ground shake beneath her. That, more than the settlement, more than the trust structure, more than anything Robert Fazio ever put in writing, is the thing I'm proudest of when I look back on all of it. I should tell you, too, about the conversation I had with Hyraa'S a few weeks after that 8th birthday, because I think it's the piece of this story that actually closes the loop. We were driving home from her gymnastics class, just the two of us, the way most of our Tuesday evenings go now, and out of nowhere, the way kids do, she asked me a question that had clearly been sitting in her somewhere for a while, waiting for the right stretch of quiet car to come out in. "Dad," she said, looking out the window instead of at me, "were you sad on my birthday?" The first one, at the old house. The balloon one. I kept my eyes on the road for a second, choosing the words the way my mother had told me to, small enough for her to carry. "A little bit," I told her. "Some grown-up things were happening that day that made me sad. But I want you to know something important, and I need you to really hear it. Not one single second of that sadness was about you. That day was still one of my favorite days, because I got to watch you turn 7, and that part was never sad. Not even a little." She was quiet for a minute, turning that over the way she does, and then she said, "Is that why you kept blowing up more balloons even after some of them popped? Because you didn't want me to notice you were sad?" I nearly had to pull over. My daughter, 8 years old, had apparently clocked something that no adult in that backyard had noticed, that I'd spent 20 minutes that afternoon quietly replacing every balloon that lost air, tying off new ones, keeping the yard exactly as full and bright as it had been at 4 o'clock, because some part of me, even then, understood that the volume of joy in that space mattered, that a thinning crowd of balloons might be the one thing that tipped her off that something underneath the day wasn't right. Something like that, I told her. "That's a lot of work just for balloons," she said. In the completely matter-of-fact way that only an 8-year-old can deliver a sentence that levels you. "It was worth it," I said. "You're always worth it." She seemed satisfied with that, the way kids are satisfied with an honest answer even when it's incomplete, and she went back to looking out the window, and we didn't talk about it again for a long time. But I've thought about that car ride more than almost any other conversation in the entire 18 months since the doorbell rang that morning. Because it told me something I hadn't let myself fully believe until she said it out loud: kids notice more than we think. They absorb the texture of a day even when we think we've protected them from its weight entirely. Which means the calm isn't just for show. It isn't just a performance you put on for the adults in the room. It's the actual environment your kid is growing up inside of, whether you realize it or not, and that's a bigger responsibility than I think I understood on the morning I picked up that manila envelope and set it down without opening it. People sometimes ask me, when they hear this story secondhand, whether I regret not fighting harder that day, not making a scene, not demanding answers on the spot, not letting Renata see exactly how much damage she'd done in the moment she did it. I understand the question. I understand why some part of people wants the confrontation, the raised voice, the dramatic unraveling that makes for a satisfying story. But I don't regret it, not for 1 second, and here's why. Every ounce of composure I held on to that day is composure my daughter got to benefit from. She got a birthday with balloons and cake and a father who showed up completely present, instead of a birthday she'll someday remember as the day her parents fell apart in front of her. She got 6 weeks of pancakes made by a man who was quietly grieving but never let her see the grief. She got a settlement built entirely around her stability instead of around either parent's need to win. And she got, 11 months later, a second birthday where both her parents stood in the same backyard, civil and present, because neither of us had spent that first day burning down the bridge we'd need to keep crossing for the next 18 years of co-parenting. That's the real lesson underneath all of this, if there is one. Not that composure means you don't feel anything. I felt everything, that whole day, every single hour of it, and long after. It just means you decide, deliberately, where that feeling gets to land. I chose for it to land at 2 a.m. in a guest room, alone, in the dark, instead of in a driveway at 8:14 a.m. in front of a stranger in a gray polo shirt, or at a party in front of a 7-year-old in a teal and gold dress who deserved, more than anyone, one uncomplicated good day. I said nothing, and I left. And then, quietly, over the following 6 weeks, I built exactly the life I wanted to be standing in on the other side of it. I think about that phrase sometimes, said nothing, and left, because I know how it can sound out of context, like defeat, like a man who didn't have the nerve to fight for what mattered to him. I want to be very clear, one more time, that it wasn't that. Saying nothing wasn't surrender. It was triage. It was recognizing, in the space of about 4 seconds standing in my own doorway, that the day had exactly one thing in it worth protecting completely, and that thing was upstairs washing her hair, 7 years old, with no idea yet that the ground beneath her house had shifted. Everything I didn't say that morning, I said later, in rooms and phone calls and conference tables built specifically for saying it, to people whose entire job was making sure it got said correctly and landed where it needed to land. That's not silence. That's sequencing. There's a difference, and learning that difference is, I think, the single most useful thing that whole experience ever taught me. It's been 18 months now since that morning. Hyra is 8.5, deep into a phase where she wants to be a marine biologist 1 week and an architect the next, and I've stopped trying to predict which one it'll be by the time she's actually old enough to decide. She splits her weeks between 2 houses without much fanfare anymore. It's just the shape her life has, the way some kids grow up with 2 sets of grandparents in 2 different states, or a sibling who's away at college most of the year. Kids adapt to the architecture you give them, I've learned, far more gracefully than the adults building it ever expect them to, as long as the architecture itself is stable and the adults inside it refuse to let their own unresolved feelings leak into the structure. I still make pancakes most mornings when it's my week. I still read the same 3 books in the same order, though we're slowly, at Hyra's insistence, working our way into slightly longer chapter books now, which feels like its own small, bittersweet milestone. Renata and I text almost exclusively about logistics, pickup times, a permission slip that needs 2 signatures, a dentist appointment neither of us wants to admit we forgot about until the reminder call comes in, and it works, not because either of us has fully healed from what happened, I suspect, but because we both decided, independently, in our own ways, that Hyra's stability mattered more than either of our unresolved feelings about how the marriage ended. I don't know if I'll get married again. I think about it sometimes, in the abstract, the way you think about a country you visited once and enjoyed but haven't made any concrete plans to return to. What I do know is that whatever I build next, whenever that is, it's going to be built the way my father built things, slow, tested, on ground I've actually walked across myself instead of ground I assumed was solid because someone told me it was. I learned that the hard way, on a Saturday morning in a driveway, holding a car full of balloons for a party I nearly didn't get to give my daughter the way she deserved. I don't intend to learn it that way twice. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to hold something enormous perfectly still for the sake of someone smaller than the problem, I hope you'll subscribe, and I hope you'll tell me in the comments what you would have done differently, or the same. I read every single one, and honestly, some of you have told me things in this comments section that have helped me more than you probably realize. One last thing, before I let you go. Someone asked me last week, in the comments on an earlier video, whether I ever regret not making Renata sit with the full weight of what she did that morning, whether some part of me wishes I'd let the anger out where she could see it, just once, so she'd fully understand the cost of the timing she chose. I've thought about that question more than I expected to. And the honest answer is no, not because I don't think she deserved to see it, but because that reaction would have been for me, not for Hyra, and every decision I made in those 6 weeks, down to the smallest one, I made by asking a single question first: does this protect my daughter, or does it just make me feel better for an afternoon? Almost everything that would have felt satisfying in the moment failed that test. Almost everything that actually mattered passed it. That's the whole formula, if you're looking for one. It's not complicated. It's just hard to do when you're standing in a doorway holding an envelope you weren't expecting. Take care of yourselves out there. And whatever day someone hands you an envelope you weren't expecting, however bad the timing is, however much it costs you privately, remember that the people watching you, the small ones especially, are learning what strength actually looks like from how you carry it. Not from whether you carried it loudly. From whether you carried it at all. Thanks for listening to my story. We'll see you in the next one.